Thanks very much, Michael, and thank you very much, Julie, for moderating that session. It's now my pleasure to introduce the last speaker for our conference today, and that is Mr. John Conger. John Conger is director of the Center for Climate and Security in Washington, where he oversees all of the center's programs. But he's also the chair of the Climate and Security Advisory Group and a senior U.S. advisor to the International Military Council on Climate and Security. Mr. Conger previously served as senior policy advisor with the center, and prior to that, as the principal deputy undersecretary of Defense and Comptroller branch at the U.S. Department of Defense, where he provided advice to the Secretary of Defense on all budgetary and financial matters, including the development and execution of DoD's annual budget of over $500 billion, which is almost as much as Canada's. Prior to his service as the Deputy Comptroller, Mr. Conger held other senior DoD roles, including Assistant Secretary of Defense for Energy, Installations, and Environment. Prior to that, he served for 12 years on legislative staffs in the U.S. Congress and was employed in the private sector as an aerospace engineer and defense analyst, supporting the Office of the Secretary of Defense. John holds a Bachelor of Science and a Master of Science in Aeronautics and Astronautics from MIT and an MA in Science, Technology, and Public Policy from George Washington University. He is also president of his own firm, Conger Strategies and Solutions, and a non-resident senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. John, welcome to Canada, if only virtually, and we all look forward to your presentation. And when you are finished, we'll have all the rest of our speakers join us for a joint Q&A session. So John, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I don't have slides. It's an old instinct that I have that whenever I was in the Department of Defense and I generated slides, people would actually like check and validate your remarks. And so I just got used to giving extemporaneous remarks, which nobody could ever vet and challenge what I was going to say. I want to talk to you a little bit today about why climate change is a national security issue, and in particular dig into the specifics on Canadian national security. I did this issue, the climate security issue, for the Department of Defense in the United States during the Obama administration. I was in charge of that portfolio. And I saw what mattered to the U.S. military, what pieces of the puzzle mattered the most, and which ones didn't matter as much. And so I want to try and share some of that insight with you. But I think what we have to start with first, and if you're going to remember any one thing from the session today, and the previous speakers were excellent, and please do sort of internalize their remarks, it's that climate change actually is a national security issue. Sure, it's an environmental issue. It's an economic issue, it's a health issue, but it is also a national security issue. Climate change is reshaping the world we live in. It's affecting everything. And so it's an everything issue, but in particular, when you have a national security enterprise that has a lot of responsibilities and of significant size, and we heard even today that it has the largest footprint within the Canadian federal government, that it's going to be impacted a lot by changes in the environment around it. And so as you think about it in those terms, quite clearly, it's a national security issue. And when I was in DoD, I used to think about it in three pieces. First, it affects the missions that are going on today. It affects infrastructure, it affects readiness, it imposes costs. When you have an extreme weather event, it might cause a hurricane in the southeastern United States, or there's a wildfire, or there's a flood. These have affected Canadian bases as well. When you have those kinds of events, they impose costs on the enterprise. And in the United States, in recent years, there have been multiple multi-billion-dollar events that have occurred. This starts to get the attention of policymakers, elected officials. They start realizing that if they have to write these multi-billion-dollar checks, maybe they should start thinking about these things in advance. So that's a piece of the puzzle. It's a very, very focused, I need to be able to do my mission, and I have a certain amount of cost that it's going to impose kind of thought. The second piece of the puzzle is it's going to create new missions. We've talked a lot about the Arctic today. And with the Arctic ice melting, you have a whole new ocean to patrol. And that, and over time, it's going to be more and more clear that that's the case. Over time, you're going to find that it's more and more a larger and larger part of the year where you're going to have that necessity. And so that becomes new missions and new requirements that are imposed upon military forces. Humanitarian assistance and disaster response is another piece of that puzzle. So you've got today's missions, you've got tomorrow's missions, and then you have sort of the geopolitical environment in which you operate. And so in a world where climate change imposes stresses on any number of nations around the world, and let's be clear, there is no nation, there's no part of the world that is immune or inoculated from climate change's impacts. When these stresses are imposed, you might have food insecurity or water scarcity. You might have economic displacement, from sea level rise or some of these other factors. The Sahara is growing and it's driving people out of that region. You can have other uninhabitable parts of the world that are emerging as global warming continues. And so as you think about those effects, they drive migration. Generally, when one area becomes uninhabitable, people move to a different area where somebody's already living because it is habitable. And so that causes tensions. So all of these pieces of the puzzle, you sort of start to think in that geopolitical sense, cause conflict or at least tension. And that it creates instability, which could create impacts that either pull you to a new area or affect the areas in which you're already stationed. And so those dynamics are all relevant to the military mission. I like to think of this not as something that the military has focused on historically because the environmental community has asked it to, but rather because they're just trying to do their job. I think fundamentally, and if you have another takeaway I'm going to highlight here, is that from a military perspective, this is all about mission. It is all about trying to do the job that they have and being able to adapt to the environment in which they have to do that job. And so if the environment changes, they have to adapt to that. They cannot afford a sort of a naysaying blind spot, or I don't have to worry about that piece of this puzzle. They have to worry about all of it in order to do their job effectively. And so as we think about this holistic puzzle, let's think about it all in the context of mission. Let's think about it all in the context of what kind of jobs the military is going to have and how climate change affects their ability to do those jobs. We did a study a couple of years ago where we solicited views from climate security experts all around the world, and said, what were your top areas, what top concerns? And what we found was it's different. No matter where you ask, every part of the world, you're going to get a slightly different answer. Now, collectively, people were talking about water security and migration and economic, impacts, or environmental impacts and environmental biodegradation, those types of things as key issues, extreme weather. But every nation has a different lens. They want a different frame. So let's look at it from the Canadian frame. When you start to look at this from a Canadian frame, and I recently authored a report for the Department of National Defense called a Climate Security Plan for Canada. And in there, I had a risk assessment part and sort of an action part. And so let's walk through each one of those pieces. When we were looking at the risk assessment, one of the things we found was that Strong, Secure, Engage, the DND's strategy, actually talks about climate change quite a bit. If you look at the climate strategy for the Canadian government, though, it barely mentions security at all. And so I think that's a framing that you're going to want to remember, that from an environmental perspective, they don't necessarily think about the security end of things. So, and from the security end of things, they need to think about this piece of it. Somehow we got to blend all that together. So in Strong, Secure, Engaged, there's the sort of strong at home piece, which talks about military forces and how those are affected. And I think if you think back to sort of my three categories from before, you've got the impacts on military forces, you've got risk to current operations and current infrastructure, because the infrastructure doesn't move really, and the climate moves on it. And so you're going to have more flooding, you're going to have wildfire risk. you're going to have different pieces of the puzzle they're going to have to deal with, and you're going to have requirements for resilience in that context. You're going to have new missions. We talked a lot about disaster response and how should it be the military's mission or not. The fact of the matter is that there probably needs to be an assessment of what those requirements are going to be going forward. As we look at climate change, are there going to be more requirements for disaster response, and how does that apply to military force structure? In the US, responding to disasters is considered a lesser included case. You build a military that's much, much bigger than that requirement for other reasons, and you figure you're going to be able to deal with disaster response. You look at a much smaller military. I had the opportunity to talk to some folks from New Zealand, and they were talking about how their military is so small, they're not there to deter an invasion. They're there to respond to emergencies. So as a consequence, climate change has an oversized impact on their sort of force structure analysis. And Canada's in the middle. Canada's got a lot of things to respond to, but as a smaller military than the United States, they have to take it into account. And I don't know if it drives the numbers or not, but they have to do that homework. And obviously, when you think about strong at home, you still have to think about the Arctic. Human security issues in the Arctic are very important. The impact on indigenous peoples, First Nations, that has to be incorporated into the analysis. How do you deal with that human security equation? Then if we start thinking about secure in North America, then we start thinking about continental defense. We start thinking about a lot of the issues that Jonathan raised and is responsible for. That we have the sort of surveillance mission up at the north, and as the Arctic ice begins to melt, you're going to start to have more traffic up there. Now, at first, you're going to have search and rescue requirements. You're going to have other pieces of the puzzle where you're going to have a lot more activity in the Arctic. How does that impact Canada's security? We have to make sure that there's preparation for that. But also, interestingly, in the secure in North America piece of the puzzle, Canada has to deal with sort of a schizophrenic world actor that is not necessarily always consistent on climate change or security posture or a whole host of other things, and that's the United States. The United States doesn't have to deal with the United States, but Canada does, and so it's a distinct and separate security challenge that they have. But a lot of the secure in North America piece of their strategy of the strong, secure, engaged is focused on how do we cooperate and collaborate with the United States. Well, the U.S. has been dealing with climate security for a long time, even during the Trump administration, and the military has been a more consistent actor in that space. Whereas the rest of the government sort of reversed course back and forth and is a lot more volatile, the military has not been. And so, collaborating military to military is a much more stable relationship on that front, on the climate front, and is certainly something worth digging into deeper. And then finally, engaged in the world. There was plenty of conversation earlier, and I don't need to repeat everything, but as one contemplates the instability and the impact on, in particular, fragile nations that climate stress is going to have and is going to have more of, how international institutions respond to that. How is NATO going to respond to that? And obviously, we heard a lot about that just a moment ago. How is the UN going to respond to it? And how does Canada work within these multilateral organizations to help promote climate security as a priority? I think that's going to be important. As we sort of think through response, and I'll use my last sort of 5 minutes to hit these points. As you think about response, we put it in the same framework as strong, secure, engaged, which they had a very nice framing of anticipate, adapt, and act. And I think you can put climate change in that frame very cleanly. You need to be able to anticipate the challenges that are coming, and that's not just science, but there's intelligence work that needs to be done. Where are those conflicts going to bubble over? Where is climate stress going to have the largest impact? That's an intelligence community job. How are you going to assess the impact on force requirements? I was talking a little bit ago about responding to disasters within Canada and how that might drive requirements for force structure and for mission. That's an analysis that needs to be done. How is it going to affect the ability to train? How is it, how are pest vectors going to change the ability to be outside in certain regions at certain times of the year? There's a whole host of sort of resilience analysis that needs to be done. When we start thinking about adapting, then you say, all right, well, assuming that all this is going to happen, how do I change? How do I mold my operations to be able to conduct the mission in this new environment? And so that is going to be about making your installations more resilient. Assume that there will be wildfires and floods. Assume that storms will knock out the power. How do you continue to operate in that environment? How do you increase your ability to operate in a newly open Arctic? I think a lot about how many icebreakers Canada has versus how few the US has. There are opportunities to collaborate and cooperate there that I think haven't been fully explored. So as we contemplate adapting to that new environment, I think that's really important. When we think about acting, I think action, when we think about acting in response to climate, then you're talking about, do I have the force to deploy to contribute to UN peacekeeping operations in an area that's newly unstable? Am I working with the G7 or NATO or the UN in order to promote these issues? Those are the kinds of actions that might be required, and that crosses over, from DND to GAC to CSIS, all of these things I've discussed. And I think, it was mentioned earlier, do we need a task force that would operate across agencies? And I think the answer is yes, and we recommended it in our report. That rather than saying you need to consolidate this or to give one entity the mission, you need to create those lines of conversation, some sort of a task force to make sure that the feedback loop is going in the appropriate places. I'm going to use my last minute or two to talk about emissions. And you'll note that none of my responses talked about emissions. I think emissions are important. In Strong, Secure, Engaged, the response was largely about reducing emissions. And I'm not sure that's really on point. When you're trying to adapt to climate change, you want to make sure that you can respond to it appropriately. But we're going to have decades of terrible things that are going to happen because of past emissions, whether we go to zero emissions tomorrow or not. And the military is going to be one of the primary organizations that has to respond to that. And so in that context, the response is less about emissions. However, it is important to recognize that there's a long-term problem that emissions very much define. That in the 20 to 30 year time frame, how the security situation looks, how the climate changes shape the world is very much defined by what we emit today. And unless we reduce emissions today, the security situation is only going to get worse, and far worse, I might add. The problem is it's not the military reducing emissions that's the key point. You could go to make the military go to zero emissions tomorrow too, but if everybody else is on the same pace that they're on, we're going to have the same security problems. But what we need is more of a global and coordinated and holistic reduction in emissions to really affect things. And that means more than just, the US or Canada. China has twice the emissions of the United States, and the US is second, in fairness, but China is about 30% of global emissions. The US is about 15%. India is about 7.5% and growing, and you've got the EU and so on and so forth. But the point there is that those large actors have to change their entire economies for this to make a difference. But disproportionately putting that on the back of the military is probably not going to get you the answers you need. They are the ones that are I muted out. They're going to need to optimize for response. They are still going to have to lead by example. They're still going to have to reduce their emissions, but that's got to be more of a team effort. But in many respects, they're going to be the only ones who respond to some of the really terrible things that happen and the emergencies that occur because of climate change. And so they have to be ready for that. And that's got to be higher on the list because it's both urgent and important in many respects. I'm going to pause there hope I've given you some food for thought, and happy to take your questions.
John, thanks very much. That was excellent. Let me now invite Michael Rula and David Harries and Jonathan Quinn to come on board. And at the same time, I invite Julie and Eric and Dr. Michael Hoare. If you have questions to pose, please feel free to come on and pose those questions. I don't know, this is a question specifically for you, John, but let me just throw it out there and see what happens. You know, we always tend to overuse phrases, and so the term I'll use now is a very overused one, which is a paradigm shift. And the paradigm shift I'm thinking about is, you know, for the past many decades, the environmental cause, you know, the climate change concept and issue really was owned by environmental activist organizations, NGOs, dare I say it, the left. And they have been very active and very vocal in that space. Now we enter into this realm of climate and climate security issues, where you now have almost a requirement for almost an unnatural kind of alliance that kind of breaks down some of the traditional thinking about who is responsible for environmental issues and so on. And because now the military obviously has an important role to play and is affected by this, there seems to me that there's going to be that paradigm shift, that breakdown between those sort of previously rigid perspectives, and we need to form alliances across perhaps a broader political spectrum. Do you see anything like that happening in the United States right now, or is it still very much a house divided?
So it's a really interesting question. I think I have like 3 or 5 or 20 different answers to it. Let me try and contain myself to 30 to 60 seconds in response, and then we let folks talk. I think it's important to recognize that the military, people look at the military and why do you care about climate change? And it's one of those things that they're confused by. You know, climate change is this left issue. The military is more of a conservative organization. This is conflict. It's confusing. I think really what's fundamental here is that the military is neither progressive or conservative. It is mission oriented. It's pragmatic. And the world is changing, and they don't care if it's a left issue or a right issue. They need to be able to protect themselves and protect their mission and focus on that. And so it's less of an issue in that context. And so what we found talking to Congress is that when we say 5 years ago, we'd have a conversation where the left and the right disagreed on whether climate change was even real. And that conversation isn't there anymore. I have found in Congress today, climate skepticism is dying out. But what you have a different dynamic is what you have is, and what we did was we engaged folks. We brought senior military folks over to Capitol Hill to talk to conservative lawmakers and said, well, we care about this stuff. Don't tell us we can't care about it because you're going to undermine the mission. Let us protect ourselves from this condition. And so they'd be all right. I can see why the military has to care about this. And so climate security became a bridge, a confidence builder for some of those members. And it was the sort of the opening parlay where we weren't getting a price on carbon or anything like that. But what we were getting was the ability to talk about resilience. And that was okay. And everybody could agree on that, and things would pass in Congress without opposition in this context. And so that was how we started the conversation. And so the environmental community were okay with that, but in general, it was the way that everybody could be on the same sheet of music, and it's still that way today. Last thought, and I'll throw this out there. There's a retired general from the Netherlands who's affiliated with the Center for Climate and Security, Tom Middendorf, and he wrote a piece a couple of years ago where he said climate change is too important to leave to the environmental ministers. Sort of echoing the old Clemenceau quote about war is too important to leave to the generals. But it's true, because it isn't just going to affect them. And it isn't just an environmental issue. It's an environmental issue, but it's all these other things too. And people have begun to realize that if something else is important to them and it's affected by climate change, they have to pay attention. And that's where we've had a lot of consensus in the military space, talking about how it affects the military, and everybody cares about the military. So they have to care about climate change. Sorry, that was more than a minute.
No, that was fine. Anyone else want to comment on that? Yes, David, please.
I chaired Canadian Pugwash for 4 years. And one of the issues that always came up whenever something other than nuclear disarmament or non-proliferation or weapons of mass destruction came up was, we don't have time for that. We haven't finished the work we've already started. And some of us would try to point out, yes, that's true, but this is a really acute problem right now. Do you remember last month when the military had to go into your community just outside Montreal with front end loaders and bulldozers to rescue people off the roof of their house? It wasn't a nuclear bomb, but as far as your well-being is concerned, it might as well have been. And we're still pressured from whether it's left or right or peace communities or security communities, with unfinished business. And that's one of the reasons I raised what I did as one example in my presentation. There are many things we have to concentrate on today, and it doesn't matter, as John and others have said, whether you're left or right. And if you are a member of an organization, you have a mission, you have a task, and that comes first, regardless of what's around you. And now that I'm no longer chair, I can take part in some of these discussions. I sort of had to be a referee while I was the chair. Things have changed because climate change has affected everybody. We had people in Alberta, the Fort McMurray wildfires, and they were talking about Ottawa not paying attention to their concerns about oil and gas and all these other things. And then that died down a bit. Then 2 years later, they had the big flood. And the same thing happened again. And that was only 2 years ago, so I'm not sure where we stand now. But I too see a greater willingness. No, that's wrong. I see less objection to getting involved in the discussions about climate change in the military, in security service, whether it's police or whatever. There is less objection to acknowledging. I finish on one point. Some of you Canadians know that the Conservative Party held a convention very recently. And the Conservative Party could not vote. They wouldn't vote on whether climate change was real. And that's an example of the sort of separation, Dan, your thing, paradigm. Climate change, they would not vote that climate change was real. What does that say about Canada? I'm not sure. Sorry.
Oh, don't be sorry. Well done. Anybody else want to jump in, or I'm going to ask another question? Fine. Jump in anytime you want. For Michael, I'm trying to understand that's wrong. I'm trying to understand how NATO is thinking about climate security in terms of, is this now sort of being seen rather strangely, just an out of area mission for NATO now? I mean, is it being looked at as a global issue that is going to affect NATO's ability to conduct operations within its traditional area of operations, or is it looking at how can NATO support global initiatives that have nothing to do with the North Atlantic or European battle space? Can you just help me understand a little bit more about that?
Yeah, in fact, there are several dimensions. I mean, we often, and I myself did it as well in my remarks, we often refer, for example, to the challenges we faced in Afghanistan when you have sandstorms that just, clog all the turbines and what have you, and you put filters on, but then the torque goes down by 20%, stuff like that. I refer to the NATO webpage. There's an article by a colleague of mine currently in NATO review, which has phenomenal photos actually on sandstorms in Afghanistan and all that. So it visualizes the problem very, very well. So Afghanistan is a in traditional terms an out of area mission, far away from home. But of course we have all kinds of climate induced problems like floods and so forth in Europe within the classic NATO area. So it's not a matter of in or out of area. It's really a matter of do we have the right tools in place? Do we have the right instruments to coordinate search and rescue? An issue that came up earlier in John Conger's remarks, for example, if the Northern Passage becomes ice free. So for us, it's not a specific region that is so interesting, but it's more generally, are our forces able to play a role in emergencies or in missions? But we've had interesting. I mean, we were looking at, for example, exchanging best practices. The French, for example, have a mission in Mali in Africa, and they too do experiments about running certain equipment in hot climate, just as Canada does cold climate. So for us, it's I think a whole hodgepodge of issues that comes together here. But what is the key is that we have, as I said earlier, we have perhaps the most interoperable military interoperable countries on this planet together in this alliance. And if we together look at the challenges that climate change causes, then I think we will also probably produce the optimal answer. We know that if you're sitting in Belgium, where I'm sitting right now as a German citizen, I'm less worried about climate change in the short run than if I would sit in the Sahel. But I think it hits us all in various ways. And even if you are fairly safe, maybe in the northern or middle part of Europe, if people in the Sahel are moving out because it's uninhabitable, some of them will end up in Europe. So you get hit by climate change either way, wherever you are, because it's a global phenomenon. And so NATO needs to wrap its head around it. We don't have to be the number one responder. We don't have to be the institution of choice, but I think we need to do more than what we currently do. And my last point, one of the things that the Secretary General is proposing in the climate change realm is to have a major, almost global kind of conference on climate change repeatedly. I mean, maybe biannual or whatever, because he thinks that climate change is not something that affects only 30 NATO member states. So he wants to move more to use climate change also as a means of, let's say, a broader how to say a push. Use climate change as a push for reaching out to a broader audience of countries. So watch this space.
Okay, thank you. Excellent answer. Mike Hoare, do you have a question?
Not really a question, but I'm looking at 3 questions from Michael Hoskin, Cameron McIntyre, and Prashant Patak. And I'm wondering if they feel that their questions have been answered yet. I'm not so sure. I think partially they may have been, but they've submitted those around 3 o'clock today. So we want to make sure we recognize them.
Right. So good call. I think we've more or less wrestled a little bit with Michael's initial question around whether or not the CAF ought to be viewed as a kind of specialist organization to deal with the disaster response. Should it be a norm for the CAF? I think we've kind of wrestled that one. The other ones I think are linked from Cameron and Prashant in terms of, I guess, Canadian priorities. You know, there was the point made by David around the disparity between the number of Canadian Armed Forces personnel operating in the Arctic vice you know, a mission in Europe or Iraq, for example, and what did that really say in terms of the order of priorities of missions for the Canadian Armed Forces? Should there be a reordering of that? And that links, I think, into what Prashant Patak was talking about, which is sort of the question of to what extent does security matter to Ottawa at all? You know, is this an issue that's going to drive decision makers to realign priorities as necessary, and of course, at the end of the day, to fund the requirements to make it all happen. So I guess that's primarily within the bailiwick of Jonathan.
Thanks, Dan.
Hi, yeah, thanks for that, Dan. Maybe a couple quick things. I know I'm conscious of the time too, and I am wrapping things up, but a couple of responses. I guess to the point on the Arctic and the extent to which it's a priority vis-a-vis other areas of operation. We're conscious of that. We're looking at that question very carefully. Many of you may have noticed NORAD modernization has come up in the Prime Minister's first meeting with President Biden and is listed as a key action item in the roadmap for a renewed partnership between Canada and the US. So NORAD obviously has a specific mission, but a big part of the value that Canada brings to that binational command is our geography, and we have a significant part to play in that. The NORAD capabilities haven't really been invested in to any extent really since the mid-'80s. So we know that that investments are overdue. More work needs to be done there. The Arctic will likely feature very prominently in that effort, not just because of the kind of increasing geostrategic importance of the Arctic itself, but also because threats don't just appear or kind of aren't generated just in the north or to the north, but they also come through that part of the world. And North America is at risk from threats that traverse the Arctic increasingly. So, under active consideration, do we have a big enough footprint in the north presently? Probably not. Do we need to have a bigger footprint? Probably. And those conversations are happening on the best way to approach that. Lots of challenges, as you can imagine. It's extraordinarily expensive to build new infrastructure in the north, astronomically expensive. Also challenging to, not that they always have a choice, but challenging to convince people to spend their lives up there. It's not like moving to a big cosmopolitan city necessarily, and it's pretty remote territory. So there are kind of some forced generation issues potentially at play as well, but certainly a big issue. And then maybe just because I'm not sure I'll have another chance to speak, so not necessarily in direct response to that question, more in response to some of the comments that John Conger made. First of all, thanks so much, I think, for your work. It's been tremendously helpful to us at DND. We've read your recent paper with great interest and fantastic ideas there. And just in response to one of the comments you made, I really liked the point you made about the military being mission oriented, and the fact that they'll kind of take into account all of the various aspects of an issue that affect their ability to deliver on that mission. So I think you're right that in Strong, Secure, Engaged, we probably focused a little too much on kind of the emissions reductions part of climate change and not enough on response. But I think going forward, it'll be really important for the Canadian military and NATO allies and around the world to kind of take both aspects of that into account to reduce their emissions. Certainly, I think everyone recognizes that they're not the only emitter in the world, so it needs to be part of a broader global effort. But they are big emitters, and it doesn't make an awful lot of sense to be investing heavily in improving your ability to respond to climate-induced crises at the same time that you're kind of exacerbating it by not reducing your own emissions. So I think going forward, we feel strongly that we need to kind of address both parts of that equation, doing our part to reduce emissions and kind of exploring alternative fuel sources and all of that good stuff. But also in the meantime, making sure that we're as well prepared as we possibly can be to respond to the climate-induced events, both at home and abroad, kind of in parallel. So I'll leave it there and let others speak.
Thanks very much, Jonathan. I have seen no new questions pop up on the Q&A function at this time. If there's anyone else on the panel that would like to have a last word, that's fine. If not, I'm preparing now, I think, to wrap up. We've reached the magic hour of 16:30 Eastern Standard Time, which was our goal. I realize it's somewhat difficult sometimes to stay on a Zoom session for an incredibly long period of time. I took a course in December. It was 2 weeks long and 5 days a week, and I was 8 hours a day on Zoom. And I barely survived it, but it was challenging. So we don't want to push people too long. So let me then wrap up by starting to say, obviously, a number of thank yous to various people. Certainly, I would like to thank all of our speakers, our panelists here today, Jonathan Quinn, David Harries, Michael Rula, John Conger. Fantastic to have you. As Mike Hoare said, one of the opportunities that the pandemic has generated for the RCMI is our ability to reach out to people literally across the world. And so we can have Michael Rula in Brussels. We can have David Harries in Kingston. He's my neighbor. John Conger in Washington. Jonathan Quinn in Ottawa. So that's a great thing. So thank you very much for taking the time to be present with us today. We really would like to have you at the RCMI in person at some point in the future, where we can host you at the Long Bar and provide you with an RCMI tie. Not that Jonathan would be wearing it, but nevertheless, he could at least hang it in his closet. I'd like to thank Julie Lindhout for being willing to moderate the session with Michael Rula. That was very much appreciated, and helping out with the Q&A section was very insightful. I'd like to thank as well Dr. Mike Hoare, President of the RCMI, for his ongoing support of the Defense and Security Studies program and recognizing how important it is for the RCMI to maintain these kind of events going forward. It's an important part of our mandate. Brian Brulotte has not online at this particular moment in time, but I would be remiss if I did not thank him in his role as CEO of Maxis, who's the sponsor for our conference today, and indeed for the DSSP program in general.
Brian
is
busy out there making money.
Yes, as well he should be. I'm sure he is. Eric Morse, you haven't really been hearing much about. He's the Chief of Communications for the RCMI and is instrumental in getting all of our marketing material together and in helping me think about what needs to be done to put on such an event as we did today. Sylvia Lau has been mentioned previously. Sylvia is she's the one behind the curtain, pulling all of the strings and levers to make this technology work. And we couldn't do this without her. She does a fabulous job, a very, very flexible, very willing person, and critical to the success of the RCMI in general. Lastly, of course, I have to thank all of our participants who attended our session today. When we have our traditional monthly speaker events, we often run them at 7 o'clock in the evening. So we weren't sure that having an afternoon session would exactly be popular. I'm very pleased to see that it was. Of course, we did this to also accommodate Michael Rula, because he's actually wearing pajamas over there in Brussels now and getting ready for bed. So we needed to accommodate him. When this session is over, Sylvia will be posting a survey for you to fill out, and it would be great if you could do that. So with that, thank you all. Please take care. Please stay safe. And I once again thank everybody for your time and participation this afternoon.